Welcome to our discussion on political participation, engaging individuals, and shaping politics. Elections, campaigns, and voting are fundamental aspects of the civic engagement of Americans and people in other democracies. These activities represent concentrated forms of civic engagement and are important both for the polity as a whole and for the individuals who participate. But intensive political engagement, working on a campaign or running for office, say, rarely represents an individual's first foray into a civically engaged life. Rather, people who are engaged in the political process usually are initiated through smaller, less intensive steps. Perhaps a group of classmates who especially enjoy the political discussions in your American government class continue their conversations of democracy over a cup of Starbucks after class. Those same classmates might begin regularly reading political blogs and daily newspapers to become better informed about candidates and issues. Some members of the informal group might decide to hear a candidate who is giving a speech on campus and wind up volunteering on his or her campaign. Political engagement often begins with small steps such as those, but the cumulative results are large. They help to ensure that government is representative of the people and responsive to their needs. Representative governments, which are the product of individuals' political engagement, tend to be more stable and to make decisions that best reflect the needs and the will of the people who elect them. Direct forms of political participation, such as voting, volunteering on a campaign, and running for office, are of keen interest to scholars of civic engagement. Many scholarly analysts have noticed an overall decrease in levels of political participation. As discussed in an earlier chapter, political scientist Robert Putnam argues that the United States is seeing a decline in its social capital, the social networks and reciprocal relationships characteristic of a community or a society. These networks are varied and include formal organizations such as clubs, fraternities, sororities, interest groups, and sports teams. But there are also informal networks such as babysitting co-ops, carpools, and study groups. Putnam details how solitary pursuits such as watching television and using a computer have pervasively replaced group activities related to civic participation. Some scholars have challenged Putnam's assertion that social capital has declined. They point out that new forms of social capital have arisen in the form of internet social networks, instant messaging, and internet activism to replace the traditional social networks that Putnam studied. Despite these differing views, there is consensus that civic participation is essential and that among its most important forms is electoral political participation. Indeed, elections offer a wealth of opportunities for citizen involvement. Members of political parties recruit candidates to run for election. Cadres of volunteers organize campaign events, including fundraisers, rallies, and neighborhood leafleting. Phone bank volunteers try to persuade other people to participate in the electoral process, for instance, by giving a campaign contribution, putting a candidate's sign on their lawn, or simply voting for the candidate. Other volunteers focus exclusively on Get Out the Vote, GOTV. That is, they work to get out the vote. They register voters for both primary and general elections, and they provide absentee ballots to people who are ill or who will be out of town on Election Day. On Election Day itself, they remind people to vote by phoning them or knocking on their door and asking if they need a ride to the polls. Others, who may be paid, volunteer to work at the polls on Election Day. Although each volunteer effort plays a part in ensuring the success of a democracy, a key form of political participation is running for office. Electoral contests in which more than one candidate seeks to win office are a fundamental component of a democracy. Every state holds at least two types of elections. A primary election comes first and determines the party's nominees, those who run for office. For most political offices, there is a little or no competition in the primary election, but in presidential and gubernatorial primary elections, vigorous contention is often the rule, particularly within the out-of-power party. House and Senate primary elections that lack an incumbent candidate, that is, one who has been elected to that office before, are also often highly competitive as many candidates attempt to win their party's nomination. In a general election, the parties' respective nominees run against each other, and voters decide who should hold office, since the person with the most votes wins. The degree of competition in general elections depends on a number of factors, including the presence of and strength of incumbency, the degree of party competition, and the level of office. In recent times, presidential elections have been brutally competitive, as have been certain gubernatorial races and many congressional contests where no incumbent is seeking re-election. Some communities, particularly big cities, may also experience intense competition for office in general elections. In a primary election, voters decide which nominees the political parties should run in the general election. But which voters decide varies greatly from state to state. In some states, only registered party members are eligible to vote in primary elections, whereas in other states, any registered voter can vote in any party's primary, and in North Dakota, voters are not even required to register. In U.S. presidential primaries, voters do not vote directly for the candidate whom they would like their party to nominate. Instead, the popular vote determines which candidates' delegates will attend the party's nominating convention and vote for that party's nominees. This system of selecting delegates through primary voting is different from the earlier system when party leaders selected the presidential nominee with little or no input from the rank-and-file party members. The two major U.S. parties made reforms to the earlier delegate selection process after the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Anti-Vietnam War activists outside the convention protested the presumed nomination of Vice President Hubert Humphrey as the Democratic Party's presidential candidate. Humphrey had not won any primaries but was favored among the convention's delegates who had been hand-picked by party leaders. The activists instead supported the candidacy of Senator Eugene McCarthy, a Democrat from Minnesota, an outspoken war opponent. The demonstrations turned into riots when Chicago police beat the protesters. The Democratic National Committee, in an attempt to address the concerns of those complaining that they had been excluded from the nomination process, appointed the McGovern-Fraser Commission, named after its co-chairs, which recommended a series of reforms to the delegate selection process. The reforms, many of which both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party adopted, significantly increased the influence of party voters. Voters could now select delegates to the national conventions, a power previously restricted to the party elite. Party voters today select the delegates at statewide conventions or through primary elections or caucuses, meeting of party members held to select delegates to the national convention. The reforms also included provisions that would ensure the selection of a more representative body of delegates, with certain delegate slots set aside for women, minorities, union members, and young party voters. These slots roughly correspond with the proportion of support the party receives from those groups. When an individual is elected to be a delegate at the national convention, often that delegate has pledged to vote for a specific candidate. That pledge is non-binding, however, since delegates of a losing candidate often switch their support to the apparent victor. In an open primary election, any registered voter can vote in any party's primary, as can independent voters not registered with a party. In an open primary, parties' ballots are available in the voting booth, and the voter simply selects privately or publicly one on which to register his or her preferences. In a closed primary election, which is what we have in the state of New York, voting in a party's primary is limited to members of that party. In some states, voters must declare their party affiliation well in advance of the primary election, sometimes as many as 60 days before. In other states, voters can declare their party preference at the polling place on the day of the election. Such restrictions on who can vote in a party's primary originated in the party's maneuvering to have the strongest candidate nominated. For example, if a popular incumbent president were running unopposed in a primary election, members of the president's party might choose to vote in the other party's primary as a way of scheming to get a weak candidate nominated. A closed primary aims to thwart that strategy. The states determine the timing of primary elections. Historically, states that held their presidential primaries early in the year had a greater say in determining the nominee than did the states with later primaries. The reason is that candidates tend to drop out if they do not win primaries, did not meet media expectations, or ran out of funds. In general, past presidential primaries gave great sway to the agricultural states because many of the more urban states' primaries fell later in the season. All of that changed in 2007 when, in an attempt to increase their political clout, a number of diverse states banded together to hold their primaries on the same day so the presidential candidates would be forced to address issues of the keenest interest to those states. These states modeled their objective on Super Tuesday, the day in early March on which the most presidential primary elections took place, many of them in southern states. Super Tuesday had been the fruit of a successful effort in 1988 by several southern and rural states to hold their primaries on the same day so as to increase their political importance and allow expression of southern voters' political will. But in 2007, the Super Tuesday strategy was challenged by state legislators in some of the most populous states, including California, New York, Illinois, and New Jersey, who sought to have their presidential primaries on the earliest day that the national political party rules allowed. In 2008, that day was dubbed Super Duper Tuesday by the media. That was February 5th. In all, 20 other states jumped on the early primary bandwagon, with the result that 24 states held their primaries and caucuses on February 5th, 2008. Under normal circumstances, such a change would have muted the impact of other primaries because the most populous states control an enormous number of delegates to the national conventions. In 2008, that was not the case. That year, the highly competitive Democratic primary between Senator Hillary Clinton and Senator Barack Obama meant that states such as New Mexico and Oregon, which had late primaries in early June, were competitive and received national media coverage. In general elections, voters decide who should hold office from among the candidates determined in the general primary election. Most general elections, including presidential elections, are held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. But because the states schedule and oversee elections, you might find that your gubernatorial election, state legislative election, or town council election occurs at a different time of the year. General elections for Congress and most state legislatures feature a winner-take-all system. That is, the candidate who receives the most votes wins that office, even if that total is not a majority, or even if an opponent receives only one vote fewer than the victor. Thus, it is not a majority, thus, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives or Senate can be elected with less than a majority of the votes in his or her district, particularly when 3 or more candidates are seeking that seat. That is called a plurality when you win the most but not a majority. Because electoral law varies from state to state, the counties and municipalities within those states have their own structures of governance. Less common kinds of elections are possible and are used in some locales. For example, some states require a runoff election when no candidate receives the majority of the votes cast. In a runoff election, if no candidate receives more than 50% of the vote, several of the top vote getters, usually the top 2, run in another subsequent election. Typically, the field of candidates is winnowed down until one candidate receives the requisite 50% plus 1 vote. Runoff elections often occur in nonpartisan municipal elections where candidates do not run on a party label. Owing to advances in technology, runoff elections can occur immediately in some states when needed. In an instant runoff election, a computerized voting machine simulates the elimination of last-place vote-getters. How does the system work? In an instant runoff, voters rank candidates in order of preference, first choice, second choice, and so on. If any candidate garners more than 50% of all the first choice votes, that candidate wins. But if no candidate gets a majority of first choice votes, the candidate in last place is electronically eliminated. The voting machine computer then recalculates the ballots using the second choice vote for those voters who voted for the eliminated last place finisher. In effect, every voter gets to choose among the candidates remaining on the ballot. This process is repeated until a candidate who receives more than 50% of the votes emerges. Today's voting machines allow this process to take place instantly. Whereas primary elections and general elections select an individual to run for and serve in office, other kinds of elections are held for the purpose of deciding public policy questions. Although no national mechanism allows all Americans to vote for or against a given policy proposal, citizens can directly decide policy questions in their states by referendum or initiative. A referendum is an election in which voters in a state can vote for or against a measure proposed by the state legislature. Frequently, referenda concern matters such as state bond issues, state constitutional amendments, and controversial pieces of legislation. An initiative, sometimes called an initiative petition, is a citizen-sponsored proposal that can result in a new or amended legislation or a state constitutional amendment. Initiative differs from referenda in that they are typically propelled to public vote through the efforts of citizen interest groups. The initiative process usually requires that 10% of the number of the voters in the previous election in that state sign a petition agreeing that the proposition or proposed measure should be placed on the ballot. An example of an initiative is California's Proposition 8, also called the California Marriage Protection Act, which passed with a majority of votes in the November 2008 state elections. With Prop 8, amended California's state constitution to read, "Only a marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California." As a state constitutional amendment, Prop 8 had the effect of overturning the California Supreme Court decision stating that same-sex couples have the right to marry. That decision had nullified a previous initiative, Prop 22, in which a majority of voters had statutorily banned same-sex marriage. A third type of special election, the recall, differs from referenda and initiatives in that it is not concerned with policy-related issues. Rather, the recall elections allow voters to cut an office holder's term of office short. Recall elections are typically citizen-sponsored efforts that demonstrate serious dissatisfaction with the particular office holder. Concerned citizens circulate a petition, and after they gather the required number of signatures, an election is held to determine whether the official should be thrown out of office. In 2010, a federal district court decided that Prop 8 violated the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. The decision has been stayed pending an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court.